All right, so now that we've talked about the demand for Mexican pesos, let's talk a little bit about the supply of Mexican pesos and things that would influence it. So, if the value of the Mexican peso went up, and the way we'd show that is when we're looking at the supply side, is we'd show that as a vertical movement, an upward movement on the supply curve for Mexican pesos. What we're saying is that the value of the Mexican peso is going up relative to the other currencies. So remember, we want to put the quantity of the currency that we're talking about, in this case the peso, on the x-axis, and then the price of the peso, the amount of another currency it takes to buy 1 peso. So if it now takes 11 cents of a US dollar to buy 1 peso instead of 10 cents of a US dollar to buy 1 peso, we're saying that the value of the peso's gone up. Okay, if the value of the peso goes up, what will that mean in terms of the supply of pesos in the future? Well, if the value of the peso goes up relative to the dollar, people in Mexico will have more, will be able to buy more American-made goods, not because their income has gone up, but because the value of the currency that they're using to buy American-made goods has gone up. So we assume that they'll go ahead and do that. When they do buy more American-made products, they'll have to supply more pesos, they'll have to exchange more pesos for dollars, and then we show that, of course, as being a rightward shift in the supply curve for, excuse me, for Mexican pesos. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about things that will lead to movements, or what we mean by a movement along the supply curve for Mexican peso versus things that would lead to a shift in the supply of Mexican pesos. So if the value of the Mexican peso were to increase, meaning that it now takes more of the other currency, more dollars to buy, or more cents of a dollar to buy 1 peso, then we show that as an upward movement along the supply curve. In other words, we're moving up in terms, we're moving vertically, if you will, upward. If, on the other hand, the value of the peso goes down relative to another currency, it now takes less currency units of another currency to buy 1 peso, or fewer U.S. cents to buy 1 peso, then we show that as moving down, sliding down the supply curve of pesos to the dollar, or dollars to the peso. Okay, what are things that would lead to shifts in the supply of Mexican pesos? So if people's income in Mexico, if Mexico's GDP went up, people would have more income. The assumption that we'd make is that they would use some of that income to buy more foreign goods, and in order to pay for them, they'd have to supply more pesos. So we show that as a rightward shift in the supply of Mexican pesos. If, on the other hand, people's income in Mexico went down, then they would probably buy less in the way of foreign goods, so they wouldn't need to supply as many pesos to exchange for dollars because they're buying fewer things made in the U.S. So we'd show that as a leftward shift in the supply of Mexican pesos. This one's a little tricky, but bear with me. If prices of American-made goods went up, in the long run, that would hurt U.S. exports, because people in Mexico would find them to be more expensive, and so therefore they wouldn't buy them. But in the short or medium run, if people are committed to buying American-made goods, and now they find out that these goods cost more, then they're going to have to supply more pesos to exchange for dollars to buy these goods. If, on the other hand, I don't know, the price of these U.S. made goods goes down for whatever reason, and again, people in Mexico are committed to buying these goods anyway, then the good news is that because they've gone down, they don't have to supply as much in the way of pesos, so we'd show that as a supply curve shifting to the left. Taste in Mexico. If taste of people in Mexico shifted towards the United States, maybe, I don't know, if Trump gets voted out of office somehow in a few years, and maybe people in Mexico celebrate by buying more American-made goods, then they'd have to pay for them by supplying more pesos. I don't know. I'm just kidding. I mean, but anything can happen, right? What if, on the other hand, people get really mad at the United States? People in Mexico don't like the U.S. anymore. Maybe we finally build that wall that Trump is talking about. Maybe they would boycott American-made products, If they did that, they wouldn't have to supply as many pesos, so we would show that as a leftward shift in the supply of Mexican pesos. All right, what about interest rates in the U.S.? If interest rates in the U.S. were to increase relative to interest rates in Mexico, then some people in Mexico might be more inclined to put their money in the United States. So they'd have to exchange pesos for dollars, and we show that as a rightward shift in the supply of Mexican pesos. If, on the other hand, interest rates in the U.S. dropped relative to interest rates in Mexico, maybe people would say, I'll just keep my money here. And so they wouldn't be supplying as many pesos to exchange into dollars because there's no need to keep your money in the U.S. Future expectations for the peso. So if, again, you're holding dollars and you're holding pesos, and you expect that the peso is going to go down in value in the future, may as well get rid of your pesos, get rid of as many of them as you can right now. So we would show that as a rightward shift. On the other hand, if you thought the peso was going to go up relative to the dollar, then the peso is going to be a more valuable currency. So you would hang on to more of your pesos. And so you'd be supplying less of them. So we show that as a leftward shift in the supply of Mexican pesos. All right, if a country has a flexible exchange rate, then what we're saying is market forces are determining the value, the exchange rate of that currency. So sticking with the peso, imagine that we've got the quantity of pesos on the x-axis and the number of units of a foreign currency it takes to buy 1 peso. So if we move up vertically on the price axis, it's saying that it's taking more units of this other currency to buy 1 peso. So in this case, this is a dollars or cents of a dollar to buy a peso. So if the demand for pesos increases, ceteris paribus, we're holding all other things constant, then we would expect the Mexican peso to appreciate in value. If, on the other hand, more Mexican pesos show up in the exchange foreign exchange markets, then ceteris paribus, we'd expect the value of the Mexican peso in terms of how many U.S. cents it takes to buy 1 peso to go down. It's now taking, when we move from top to bottom on the vertical axis, what we're saying it's taking fewer units of the other currency to buy 1 peso. Does that make sense? So either supply or demand will, or both supply and demand will determine what the exchange rate is in if a country has a flexible exchange rate system. All right, what about a fixed exchange rate system? What does that look like? What happens in a fixed exchange rate system is that the central bank will determine the official exchange rate. Now, if the official exchange rate is close to what that exchange rate would be in a parallel market, there probably isn't much of a problem. The problem arises when we have an official exchange rate that is very, very far away from the exchange rate in a parallel market. And what I mean by a parallel market is there's always going to be somebody who's going to make a market for any type of a product. Generally speaking, if if the official exchange rate, let's say it's 2 cents of a dollar is not that much of a difference, then a lot of people may not go through the trouble of seeking out a better exchange rate in this parallel market. It might be easier just to go to the bank or something like that. But if you look at a country, let's say like Venezuela, where the official exchange rate is way out of whack with the exchange rate that you can get in the black market. I hate that term black market because, I don't think markets have a color, first off. And there's probably nothing bad or negative about looking for a better exchange rate than the one you can find at the bank. So if they're way out of whack, then it's going to be hard for that central bank in that country to maintain that exchange rate. It's not saying it's impossible, but they're gonna have to take certain steps to maintain that. So imagine that a parallel market sets the exchange rate between the dollar and the peso at 10 U.S. cents to the peso. Imagine that the official exchange rate in Mexico is 12 U.S. cents buys 1 peso. So if you walked into a bank in Mexico and you wanted to exchange your pesos for dollars, this is the rate that they give you. Then what we're saying over here is that at that official exchange rate, the Mexican peso is overvalued relative to the dollar. And what you'd expect to see is a surplus of pesos to the dollar, because people would say, okay, I'll take that. I'll take that. I've got pesos. That's great. I'll take 12 cents instead of 10 cents. I'd much rather get 12 US cents for 1 peso than 10 US cents to 1 peso. All right, let's say on the other hand, we had a situation where, again, we've got some market out there that is setting the exchange rate between the peso and the dollar at 10 US cents buys 1 peso, but the official exchange rate is 8 US cents buys 1 peso. So you walk into a bank in Mexico, you want to exchange your pesos for dollars. It's going to take, they'll give you dollars, but it'll be at the rate of 8 US cents. Well, then what we're saying over here is that the bank is undervaluing the peso relative to the dollar. So, if you didn't like that, you could go to the parallel market, I guess. Does that make sense? All right, so how would a country that has a fixed exchange rate system manage to maintain that? So let's go back again to the pesos and dollars. Imagine that the exchange rate between the peso and the dollar in some kind of a parallel market. This could be an underground market, or it could be a market. It could be the exchange rate in an offshore market, let's say, maybe not in Mexico, but maybe in the United States, or maybe in a third country. In some market, we're saying that the exchange rate between the peso and the dollar is 6 US cents buys 1 peso, but the Mexican government is saying that the target exchange rate is 8 US cents buys 1 peso. So they're overvaluing the peso relative to the dollar. Can they do this? And the answer is yes, as long as they're willing to buy up any surplus of pesos. So if the exchange rate, according to this graph, if the exchange rate is 8 US cents buys 1 peso, then it looks like we have a surplus of 50 million pesos per day. So what would have to happen would be that the central bank would have to take its reserves and go into this foreign exchange market and buy up 50 million pesos per day to maintain that exchange rate. And as long as it has the foreign reserves to do that, it can maintain an overvalued currency. I'm not sure that would be a good thing to do with its foreign exchange reserves, but it could do that. This is an article from the Tico Times, which is an English language newspaper in Costa Rica, and it was talking about the end of inflation in Costa Rica. So inflation used to run at double digits, and then starting around 2009, 2000, well, actually maybe like 2007 or so, inflation really started to decline. And so, what was the reason? The reason had everything to do with the exchange rate policy in Costa Rica. So, what they were trying to do in Costa Rica was maintain competitiveness in what they call their traditional exports. So their traditional exports were things like coffee, banana, sugar, pineapple, things that they're competing against other countries to export. The problem was they were getting huge inflows for a small country like Costa Rica of foreign investment. There was money coming in to buy land from foreigners. There's additional tourism money. And all this had the effect of pushing up the value, all other things being equal, of the cologne. Well, they didn't want that. So what they did was they intervened in the currency markets to push down the value of the cologne so that these traditional exports could remain competitive. And when they did that, they flooded the market with colones that ultimately wound up finding its way back to Costa Rica and creating more inflation. As soon as they stopped that policy, the inflation pretty much went away as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some exchange rate terminology. A managed float or a dirty float is when a country engages in somewhat frequent intervention in an exchange rate, in a currency's exchange rate, in a market where it's normally a floating exchange rate. So it's mostly floating, but maybe every once in a while they'll come in and they'll buy or sell their own currency to maintain a certain value. If a currency has a floating exchange, is operating under a floating exchange rate system, and it goes down in value relative to other currencies, we say that that currency has experienced a depreciation. If, on the other hand, this currency floats but it goes up in value relative to other currencies, we say that it has appreciated in value. And then if we're talking about fixed exchange rate currencies, if the government comes out one day and says the official exchange rate is now lower than it was before, then we say that the country's currency has been devalued. If, on the other hand, again, we're talking about a fixed exchange rate system, and the government comes out and says the official exchange rate between our currency and this other currency is now greater than it was the day before, then we call that a revaluation. The thing you always have to remember when we talk about fixed exchange rate systems is that there's probably always going to be a parallel market somewhere that keeps everybody honest. And if there's a big difference between the official exchange rate and that exchange rate you can get in a parallel market, then these exchange rates may not matter all that much. All right, so let's talk a little bit about a thing called capital flight and hot money. These are sort of, I like to describe these things as being two sides of the same coin. So capital flight is when people will kind of head for the exits in a country because they don't like the way things are shaping up. Maybe they're afraid that something's going to happen. They want to get their money out of the country as soon as they possibly can. People are heading for the exits. It's usually motivated by some kind of an adverse or bad condition in that country. Hot money, on the other hand, is when money flows into a country very rapidly, usually to take advantage of some positive aspect of the economy. Generally speaking, could be like higher interest rates. So a big difference between the two. They're like two sides of the same coin. The difference being that one thing is motivated by people who fear that their money is going to be lost if they keep it in a country. That's capital flight. Hot money is motivated by an opportunity to make more money by investing in that other country. The reason I bring this up is because both these things can have an impact on the exchange rate for a country's currency. Usually you won't see these two things happening to the same country, same currency at the same time. So let me give you an example of a time we had hot money that was driving up the value of the US dollar. So back in the 1980s, we were trying to get inflation under control. The Fed, the central bank, cut back the money supply pretty drastically in order to do that. Interest rates shot up, and there was a long period of time when hot money was flowing into the United States to take advantage of these higher interest rates. So the example I'm going to use is, imagine that you're a money manager, and you could be either a money manager in New York or a money manager in London. And let's just, to keep the analogy simple, let's imagine that there's only two markets you invest in. You either invest in London or you invest in New York, whether you're the money manager in New York or the money manager in London. So if you're a money manager in London and you're looking at the different interest rates, an interest rate in New York versus an interest rate in London, and you notice that the interest rate in New York is higher than it is in London, you're probably going to exchange more pounds for dollars because you want to put more of your money in, you want to invest more of your money in the United States. So we show that as a rightward shift in the supply curve for pounds. And so this is going to have the effect of the dollar essentially appreciating. Well, what do I mean by that? It's now taking fewer dollars to buy 1 pound than it did before because of this leftward shift in the supply of, excuse me, rightward shift in the supply of pounds. At the same time, imagine you're this money manager in New York, and sometimes you put money in London, sometimes you put money in New York, you're chasing the highest interest rate. And again, you notice that the interest rate in New York is higher than it is in London. Well, you're not going to be putting as much money into London anymore, so your demand for pounds is going to shift to the left. And that's also going to have the effect of driving up the value of the dollar relative to the pound. Or you could look at it the other way, driving down the pound relative to the dollar. So both these things in combination will lead to a more favorable exchange rate in terms of dollars to pounds and a less favorable exchange rate in terms of pounds to dollars. And this actually happened in the 1980s. All right. Thanks a lot, folks. I will be posting this shortly.